go ahead and get started. My name is Elizabeth Dreiser, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's inaugural Roots Learning Series, developed by the Funder Coalition Ending Food-Related Disease, in concert with the Samuel Lawrence Foundation and Eat Real. I'd like to thank the leadership of both organizations and our wonderful speakers. I'd also like to thank the many hands behind the scenes that made today's event possible. Laura, Maria, Tony, Natalie, and Mattia, thank you all. And now we'll turn our attention to today's topic. This personally is, I think, one of the intriguing realities of our time. The surprising reason our health and mental health, particularly for children, are collapsing, and what U.S. health foundations can do about it. After our panel's presentation and discussion, the impetus for the coalition will become clear. We'll also share plans and participation opportunities for those that are so inspired. So it is now my pleasure to introduce the coalition's program manager, Thomas Evans. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you all for your attention. Only through collaboration can we begin to address and facilitate the urgent system-wide transformation that we will discuss today. My name is Thomas Evans with the Samuel Lawrence Foundation. We connect our community through advocacy, education, and science. We're pleased to be partners in this important coalition and to support efforts to safeguard our nation's health, particularly the mental health, physical health of our children, our community, and our future. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the CEO of the award-winning organization Eat Real and our moderator this morning, Nora LaTorre. Nora is chairwoman of the Aspen Institute's Socrates Scholars, part of the X Prize community, and sits on the Tufts Food and Nutrition Innovation Council. She is a preeminent member of the California Government Farm to School Working Group, and recently, Nora shared the message of the Great American Health Collapse on the TED main stage. Under her leadership, Eat Real is on track to optimize $1 billion of school cafeteria budgets by the end of 2025. Their goal is to make healthier and greener meals accessible to all children. Nora invests in collaboration to nurture innovation and rising stars. It is my honor to invite Nora LaTorre to the stage.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you to the Samuel Lawrence Foundation and to everyone that's here today. So yeah, I'm Nora LaTorre, CEO of Eat Real, where we believe every child deserves a healthy, delicious future on a livable planet. I'm going to share a little bit about the macro situation that we find ourselves in globally and nationally. And then I have the distinct privilege of introducing three of my absolute favorite, truly legendary doctors that are at the forefront of food as medicine, of upstreaming health throughout the world and throughout our nation, and talking about the brain gut microbiome. And really, they are some of the top educators and top thinkers on our food system and our metabolic health in the world. So it is truly an honor to be helping facilitate this today. So first of all, I'd like to share a few slides. So highest level, ultra-processed food-related disease is growing across the world and across our nation in the United States, and it's preventable. Ultra-processed diseases like cardiovascular disease, heart disease, many types of cancers, obesity, diabetes, etc. These are ultra-processed food-related diseases. You may not have heard this term, but these are ultra-processed food-related diseases, and these diseases are preventable. They can actually stop these diseases before they start by helping people have access and the knowledge to enjoy real food. And so at the next slide that I'll go through is just about how expensive this is globally. So globally, our food system today costs over $12.7 trillion annually. And that is just some of the hidden costs of our global food system. And that equates to 10% of our global GDP. In addition to the loss of human health and the planetary impacts, it's an expensive economic problem. So I think it's really important to talk about the cost benefits of thinking creatively about how do we upstream change our food system to optimize human health and planet health to prevent these expensive costs. So the biggest driver of these food costs is ultra-processed food. So in the United States today, we spend about $4.1 trillion annually, and it's going up. It's been going up every year. The most recent numbers show 4.1 trillion, and every year that I talk about this, it has been going up. So we spend $4.1 trillion, and 75% of those dollars, over $3 trillion, are preventable ultra-processed food-related diseases. And so that is what a lot of people call it, that these aren't healthcare dollars. These are actually sick care dollars. It's going to treat sickness that could be prevented. And so I'm a mom, in addition to being a CEO of a Eat Real award-winning nonprofit. And I was just running the national numbers on life expectancy. And life expectancy actually in the United States in 2014 peaked. What people don't know, and that's 6 years prior to COVID, what people don't realize is that the biggest driver in that all of a sudden drop in lifespan in America is ultra processed food related disease. It was then the biggest driver of comorbidities and our vulnerability during COVID. And as a result, we actually, myself as a 38-year-old millennial, elder millennial, some could say geriatric millennial, as a millennial, 38 years old, my son, Nico, who's 3, will see 1.5 fewer years than I will. And the reason that his life expectancy is 1.5 fewer years, or 511 sunrises, he'll get to see 511 fewer sunrises than I will. The key reason of that decline in life expectancy is ultra-processed food-related diseases. So ultra-processed food-related diseases are not only expensive globally and expensive naturally to the tune of $3 trillion, it's shortening our children's lifespans, health spans, and we'll learn today about how it's also shortening their happiness spans. And we're actually calling this phenomenon American health collapse, because in America, we really pride ourselves on progress and giving our kids a better life than we had, or at least as good of a life as we had. And by many measures, with their giving our children and our 3-year-olds in America shorter lifespans, shorter health spans, and shorter happiness spans, we can't ensure that we're giving them a better life than we had. And so I think the call of this century and of this time is to restore American lifespan, health span, and happiness span, and work on this globally, because this is a global phenomenon as well. So I just wanted to really quickly on the next slide share a snapshot of the cost of food-related diseases in one state, and what the kind of breaking it down a little bit for everyone. In 2016, and again, these numbers have gone up significantly. In 2016, it was over $141 billion in California was spent on 6 chronic conditions, ultra-processed food-related diseases. So this is really important just at a state level, at a national level, at an international level. These diseases are wreaking havoc on our economy and on the health and the vibrancy of our communities and our children. So what do we do about it? That's what we're here to talk today about more about what does this mean on a personal level for people? And then what do we do structurally to make changes to change this unnecessary trajectory that we're on, this health trajectory that we're on. So at Eat Real, the nonprofit that I lead, we do 3 things. We change our food system through advocacy. We just helped pass one of the highest nutrition standards ever in America's history last week. We raise awareness, like conversations like today, and we have a chef council, and we run campaigns. And then we also change the menu on the largest fast food restaurant chain in America. I think you're thinking about some Arches, maybe thinking McDonald's, but actually in unit locations, next slide, the largest fast food restaurant chain in unit locations is Subway. There are 20,000 Subways, but US schools are the largest fast food restaurant chain in America because they're bigger than Subway, Starbucks, and McDonald's combined. There are 90,000 public schools, which is, more than quadruple that of Subway's, and they serve 7 billion meals to 30 million kids. And for low-income kids and historically underserved communities, this represents 30 to 100% of those kids' calories. So at Eat Real, in addition to changing policy and raising awareness, we actually change the menu and stand next to local food heroes in a community-driven model where we overhaul and make those school meals delicious, culturally relevant, and sustainable and nutritious. And so it's really exciting. The White House just announced that we're launching in 15 states, that we're taking this model nationally, and that we can optimize $1 billion of US cafeteria budgets. And what I like to acknowledge is that changing and optimizing that lever point in our food system then helps reduce these larger $1 trillion healthcare, sick care spend costs that I mentioned earlier. So we're really excited about this. And in the next slide, you can see our systemic approach of really grassroots change, surround sound and awareness building, and then top-down policy change. And it's working. In the last 5 years, we've 100x'd, and we have our impact and the number of students that we serve, and that's going to grow exponentially this year. And so I just want to highlight Eat Real as one of the many solutions that's working and that can really change the tide. And so excited and thankful for you all to be here, because we need your guidance, we need your help, we need everyone in this working together, and a special thanks to our doctors. So with that, I'm going to hand the mic over to our doctors for them to share more. And we're going to start with Dr. Emeran Mayer, and I will be reading his bio. I know he is so impressive, and so I just want to make sure that I read his bio so that you can really understand the caliber of leaders that we have with us today. Great. So Emeran Mayer is a world-renowned gastroenterologist and neuroscientist with 40 years of experience studying clinical and neurobiological aspects of how digestive system and nervous system interact in health and disease. He has received numerous awards, including Distinguished Mentor Award from the American Gastroenterological Association and the Ismar-Boas Medal from the German Society for Gastroenterology and Metabolic Disease, and the 2016 David McLean Award from the American Psychosomatic Society. His long-term research focuses on the role of the gut microbiota and brain interactions, and chronic visceral pain has expanded to include inflammatory bowel disorders, emotion regulation, chronic visceral pain, food addiction and obesity, cognitive decline, and autism spectrum disorders. His research has been continuously supported by the National Institutes of Health, NIH. He has published over 425 peer-reviewed scientific articles, including 100 chapters and reviews, co-edited 4 books, and organized several interdisciplinary symposia in the area of mind-body interactions and chronic visceral pain. He has published The Mind-Gut Connection, one of my favorite books, it's on my other shelf, book in 2016, which became and remained an Amazon bestseller, and which has been translated into 16 languages. His next book, The Mind-Gut Immune Connection, which links the health of the soil and plant microbiomes to gut and brain health, was published in 2013 and just appeared as a paperback. His latest book, Interconnected Plates, is a Mediterranean-inspired cookbook for optimal gut health. And with that, I introduce to you the incredible Dr. Emeran Mayer.
Thank you, Nora, for this kind introduction. And I would also like to thank you for inviting me to this illustrious panel. It's a real pleasure to be here and to contribute to this amazing effort that your organization has been spearheading. Next slide, please. Okay, just to remind the audience, this has been sort of almost like career-modifying event for me to publish these books aimed at the lay public, because before I was just lecturing to my colleagues in gastroenterology who 30 years ago had no interest whatsoever in the brain-gut connection, but it's nice to see that this has sort of become mainstream in the last few years. Next slide. So let me start with something that I think is often not mentioned. So we heard about the ultra-processed food and the key role that it plays in our current chronic disease, non-contagious disease epidemic. So recently I was invited to a symposium at the Beth Israel Hospital, Harvard. I was staying in the guest house like a couple of minutes away from the university. And I saw in the elevator this advertisement on the left side, and I actually want to check it out. I went to that restaurant as well, where most of the visitors that come to Harvard are supposed to have their breakfast and dinner. And it was shocking to see basically an advertisement of the standard American diet. If you look at it a little bit closer on the right side, yeah, you can badmouth this, you can say there's too much sugar in it, but one thing that is important to realize, what we have been doing with this diet, and it's still very popular. I think still a majority of people are hooked on this. And so the main culprits in there is the high amount of sugar, saturated fats, starchy carbohydrates, alcohol, maybe not such a big item, but also more recently the microplastics that we don't really know yet exactly how they get into our bodies and if they are absorbed. The key issue here is all these food items are taking advantage of a extremely well-developed absorption mechanism in the first part of our small intestine, including the duodenum, and they're being directly absorbed. So whenever you eat, all of this is being absorbed in the first few inches of your small intestine, and nothing goes downstream, sort of like the Colorado River. Nothing ends up at the time it goes into the Pacific Ocean. Next slide, please. So if you now look at the right upper part of this slide, there's many components or ingredients of diet that do not go this short circuit. And they include large molecules that cannot be absorbed in the small intestine. We don't have the mechanisms to break them down into absorbable components. It's also the fiber molecules, the same thing, too large to get absorbed intact. There's many other phytochemicals, and there's some fats, some healthy fats that are also not taken out before this the food that we consume gets down to the microbes. So the microbes play this key role in taking care of these health-promoting elements of our diet. The Mediterranean diet on the left side, this diagram shows, and we all know this, the Mediterranean type diets, which have now been shown in many studies to are associated with greater health. The main addition to our diet that this dietary pattern makes is to add the polyphenols, the phytochemicals, and the fiber molecules that are aimed really, or that require the gut microbiome, these 100 trillion microorganisms living in the second half of our gut, in the end of the small intestine and in the colon. These microorganisms have lived with us for millions of years. They've been around on the planet for billions of years. They have a lot of wisdom stored in their vast genetic pool, 100 million genes. And so what has happened with the modern diet that we basically deprive or starve this microbial ecosystem that has developed as a health promoting. It's part of, people call us a holobiont. So we live with these microbes in close interactions. What the ultra-processed food diet has done, it basically takes more and more out of the nutrients that we ingest from this health-promoting pool in the second half of our intestinal system. So that's one insight that is important to realize. Next slide, please. So what happens down there in the microbial ecosystem? Let's first look at this from a healthy diet standpoint. So minimally processed, full of complex carbohydrates, i.e. fiber, polyphenols, and other large molecules. They are associated with a healthy microbiome. The microbes are experts in fiber degradation and processing of all the other large molecules into smaller components that are absorbable and have health-promoting effects. This diet is associated with a greater diversity of this ecosystem and an abundance of mucus-stimulating microorganisms. I'll tell you this in a minute why that's important, and an intact gut barrier. So if you look at the middle part of this slide, the healthy gut, a large number of and a highly diverse group of microorganisms that's separated from our intestinal wall by this thick mucus layer. The mucus layer itself is a product in part by the microbes. And so the microbes are prevented from making contact with immune cells that are part of our intestinal layer. And so they're completely, even though just a few microns away, they're completely separate from our immune system. And once they get down there and are broken down by the microbes, there's a whole factory, you could say, that produces different kind of smaller molecules. Particularly well-known are these short-chain fatty acids, or butyrate, that are anti-inflammatory and self-healing molecules, not just in the gut, but also in the immune system and even all the way to the brain. So a healthy diet nurtures this factory that we have inside of ourselves that keeps our gut, our immune system, our brain healthy. Next slide. So with the standard American diet, which is made up of these refined carbohydrates, ultra-processed foods, high sugar amount, high fat, low fiber, but there's minimal now need for fiber degradation because nothing gets down there into this ecosystem. It's a decrease in the gut microbiome diversity. Any ecosystem becomes less effective when the diversity goes down. There's a decreased abundance of these mucus-stimulating microorganisms, a thinning of the mucus layer, and a compromise of the gut barrier. So you can see this in the middle again, a shrinking of this mucus layer. Now, microbes, even healthy ones, get in contact with these immune cells, sensors. They ring the alarm bell, and inflammatory molecules get into the systemic circulation, causing something that's been called metabolic endotoxemia. We know endotoxemia from an infection, but this is not related to an infection, but it's related to this process of generating inflammatory molecules. And when these molecules get into our systemic circulation, in combination with increased genetic risk, they increase the likelihood that this individual develops any one of these components of our chronic disease epidemic. And we basically starve or make bankrupt these systems in the body that are producing the protection of these anti-inflammatory molecules. So this is one key concept, I think, that makes it easy to understand why the modern diet has these widespread, seemingly non-specific effects on the body. Next slide. So what happens in the gut doesn't stay in the gut. So in this slide illustrates the bidirectional interactions between what goes on in the brain, how this affects the gut through the autonomic nervous system. Gut is a very complex system made up of the microbes, immune cells, endocrine cells, and the interaction of these brain inputs, chronic stress, as well as the negative influence, as I just showed you, of the standard American diet on this system, results in stress-induced alterations of gut connectome. So I do consider the standard American diet a major stressor, a perturbation. This leads to the generation of microbial neuroactive metabolites and immune mediators that can now get through the body to the brain and cause neuroinflammatory changes, neurodegenerative changes, and also modulates emotional networks within the brain that cause anxiety and stress reactivity. So this always goes in both directions. What happens in the brain is reflected in the gut, and what happens in the gut is reflected in the brain. This makes these events related to a diet, to an unhealthy diet, so detrimental that it's not an isolated gut phenomenon just causing, like peptic ulcer disease or even inflammatory bowel disease. It affects the whole body. Next slide. Okay, so through it, I hope I could give you some snapshot, about a system that is increasingly the science that is evolving in this area of the microbiome science is increasingly getting more complex. I think we're just at the beginning of understanding it. But I think what we can say today, even with the limited amount of information that we have, is that it is a essential connector between what we eat and what goes on in our body, our health, and our chronic diseases. And it gives us a direct pathway of influencing in a positive way and reversing this chronic epidemic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mayer. That was fascinating, and the visuals of our gut factories and thinking about how that really energizes our entire body, our brain, and our short-term, immediate, and long-term health was very powerful. Thank you so much for this presentation and for your incredible visionary leadership. Wonderful. Well, next, I have the privilege of introducing you to Dr. Uma Naidoo. I am a big fangirl, and she knows that I watch her work very closely and have seen her at many leading conferences, and just am a true fan and very grateful for your leadership and your support of Eat Real as well. I am going to read your bio because I want everyone to understand how powerful your contribution is to society. So Dr. Uma Naidoo, she is a Michelin-starred chef. The late David Bouley described Dr. Uma Naidoo as the world's first triple threat in the food and medicine space, a Harvard-trained psychiatrist, professional chef graduating with her culinary school's most coveted award, and a trained nutrition specialist. Her nexus of interests have found their niche in nutritional psychiatry. Dr. Naidoo founded and directs the first hospital-based nutritional psychiatry service in the United States. She is the director of nutritional and lifestyle psychiatry at the Massachusetts General Hospital, MGH, and is director of nutritional psychiatry at MGH Academy while serving on the faculty at Harvard Medical School. She was considered Harvard's food mood expert and has been featured in the Wall Street Journal. I also want to mention that I just read her article that featured her work in Vogue. Dr. Naidoo is also the national best-selling author of This Is Your Brain on Food. In her book, she shows the cutting-edge science, explaining the ways in which food contributes to our mental health and how a diet can help treat and prevent a wide range of psychological and cognitive health issues, from ADHD to anxiety, depression, OCD, and others. Her newest book, which just came out, Calm Your Mind with Food, is available now. In Calm Your Mind with Food, Dr. Naidoo shows readers a full-body approach to relieving anxiety. Her book presents research about ways anxiety is rooted in our brains and connected to our entire bodies, from our immune systems to our digestive systems. Accompanied by anti-anxiety recipes and meal plan guidelines, Dr. Naidoo shows us how to effectively use food and nutrition as an essential tool for calming the mind. And I'm excited for her to share now how we can use food to help us nourish the future. Dr. Naidoo.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Nora. Thank you for inviting me to this amazing panel of colleagues and friends. And it's both a privilege and an honor to be here and to work with you in Eat Real. Can I have the next slide, please? So by definition, nutritional lifestyle and metabolic psychiatry is not necessarily something that rolls off the tongue or something that people are fully aware of. And this is because it is a nascent field. It is in its infancy, but myself and several colleagues really trying to move it forward in the mental health space, because we know that, those of us who have practiced psychiatry for more than a couple of decades now know that mental health has been in a crisis for quite some time. But the pandemic had a way of really lifting the face off of that crisis and making it front and center, which I think for the purposes of interventions is very important. But nutritional psychiatry offers clinical guidance based on nutrition science and evidence-based research for the use of healthy whole foods and nutrients to improve mental well-being. We also are learning, and I know that my colleague Dr. Lustig will speak more to this, that mental health and metabolic health are now inextricably linked. And we know that in the US, not only are we mostly eating the standard American diet or Western diet, rich in ultra-processed foods, but we also know that we're facing this obesity epidemic and that many individuals are overweight. So bouncing off of that, we know that those conditions are also, certainly for the purposes of the work that I do, intricately related with poor mental health. We also understand that lifestyle factors play a huge role, but are frequently not really able to be included or not really included in physician visits. Next slide, please. We know that there's also a public health crisis that is paralleling everything else going on in mental health, because bad diet is the #1 cause of poor health in the US as well as worldwide. Yet is the one factor that is, except for the food is medicine movement and the food is medicine movement in mental health, it really is not being addressed front and center other than in amazing conferences and discussions like this. So I feel that not only at the last count, I think it was that only 20% or 1/5 of US medical schools are teaching enough nutrition. We know that certainly we've had that problem at Harvard itself. We now have a division of nutrition and are publishing the first textbook for medical students that will be coming out in July, really to help educate our own medical students on nutrition, but also to be used by other medical schools. And we see this as a huge gap, and it's something that we would try to address on a level, especially within government and through the Massachusetts Senate. Next slide, please. This is no big surprise. The foods that people consider comfort foods, which I'm asked about all the time, are really discomfort for the brain, meaning that they are the most consumed. They are processed, ultra-processed, fast foods, junk foods, and more. The things that are not always as well known are that these foods are created, designed, developed, and millions of dollars go to the research and development of making these foods hyper-palatable. What that means is that when you eat them, you start to crave them. They tap into not only to your cravings, but they really release and work. And this has been shown certainly in studies to act when we consume foods with high sugar. They actually work at similar pathways to the dopamine reward pathways that also are activated when street drugs like cocaine are used. The take-home message from this is that these foods basically lead to us having cravings. We want more. We always go to the fast food window. We pull up, we upsize the fries, and when we upsize that bag of fries, we eat the whole thing and then we want more. And this is the issue with what Americans are facing. The foods are engineered that way. In fast food French fries, actually, some brands contain sugar, and the sugar is added to make them hyper-palatable. So this is something that not only is a public health crisis, it's not really something the public can fight, other than, in my opinion, voting with their dollars, which is not supporting or buying less or eating fewer of these ultra-processed foods, and really adding in healthy whole foods, which is actually what the article in Vogue was about. It's really returning to real food. How do we solve that problem? It's a very hard one, because for one thing, other countries in the world want to emulate the US, and they build fast food places, which is why there are obesity epidemics in other countries as well. So I think this is much more of an issue for me and for the work that I do in my little world. It's really about where can I offer the most education to my patients, to my followers, to the public around how can we improve mental health through how we're eating, and how can we really go back to the way that our grandmothers ate. I have a funny story. I grew up in South Africa, and I moved to Boston to study. And the first time that I encountered a Pop-Tart was in Boston. And I'd never seen anything like it in my life. And it just always reminds me of how in the US, you enter the country and there's so many amazing things about it, but there are also these things that, are not so cool, because they provide solutions that seem really, really great, but in fact are killing our health. And in fact, just causing our obesity epidemic. So I think that understanding that these are not the foods we want people to be going toward, but that it is hard for individuals, families with kids to give them up. How do we provide real solutions? Well, one way is to teach children to eat healthy through schools. When they understand that when they know what it is to work in a community garden and grow some herbs or see plants coming, that they're attending to and then eating or helping prepare a meal, whether it's kids cooking classes, whether it's community gardens, whether it's school gardens, and less emphasis on things like the meals that they are usually eating, or the vending machines that were placed in schools when some funding years ago changed, and the government changed the funding around the dollars going towards school lunches. And what essentially happened was that some of the big food companies put in vending machines. So these are things that, organizations like Eat Real are really taking on front and center by working in government and working in the right places to help edit these things. But I do think education, how kids are eating, how families understand food become hugely important. Next slide, please. So just want to run through two quick studies. This one I thought was helpful because it showed that no study, by the way, in nutrition science is perfect. There are always pros and cons, but overarchingly, the studies I'm about to share are only two, but I think that they highlight points that I think we need to be paying attention to. It showed that high fried food consumption impacts anxiety and depression due to imbalances in lipid metabolism, disturbance, and neuroinflammation. We know that in nutritional psychiatry, there are several mechanisms that impact how the food we eat really changes mood, increases anxiety, as well as several other conditions. And one of those is inflammation and neuroinflammation. Another is oxidative stress. Another is how the gut-brain axis can be used and harnessed to be a powerful vector in changing how we eat and adapting how we eat to improve things like inflammation and oxidative stress, which can then improve symptoms. And I see this clinically all the time. So just one more study pointing to the fact that these foods are not the healthiest for us. Yet I just saw on television yesterday that there has been an increase in the price of fast foods and people are objecting. So let us also understand that the country is consuming these foods, and how do we change it? It is through organizations like this and through these types of conversations. Next slide, please. So in this particular study, what I wanted to point out, I know Dr. Mayer commented on short-chain fatty acids. Well, this was an animal study performed in early 2022 or published in early 2022. And what it showed was that the carboxymethylcellulose is a food thickener. And if you're into reading food labels, you might see it, but essentially it's used to thicken foods. And when added to the study and fed to these mice, it basically had a detrimental impact on the gut microbiota and the metabolome, and it led to less to no production of short-chain fatty acids. So although this was an animal study, what I want to point out, it did show a correlation between a dietary thickener often added to our foods and the impact directly on the gut microbiome. So it's worth noting that as this research continues, and there's much more research even since that point, we just need to understand that the science is slowly and steadily following and is helping us understand that these are not the best choices in terms of what we eat. And the conversation really has to go back to what can we do differently. Next slide, please. So in summary, I want to share a little bit. These are the books that I've written, and I wanted to pause on the slide just to tell you a little bit about the direction that I'm taking and working with colleagues to take the food as medicine movement in mental health to a different level. I work with the New Nutrition Initiative at the World Economic Forum. I'm on a task force with the United Nations on mental health. Also creating a program with the United Kingdom College of Medicine called the Mood Food Campaign. And I mentioned the textbook that we've written for medical students that will be available to all medical schools so that medical students actually have a handbook. Since we're not taught enough nutrition, they have a handbook of things and faculty experiences and research based, as well as case studies in this textbook that they can carry around to help. We also created a course for clinicians that is asynchronous learning, available at the Massachusetts General Hospital Psychiatry Academy. There are two courses. One is a cooking for mental health, cooking program for mental health professionals, so how to actually cook for better mental health, and it pairs up with the primer in nutritional psychiatry. And these are, where I'm focusing a lot of my attention these days, is building the educational platform for peers, for all clinicians who want to use nutritional, lifestyle, and metabolic psychiatry as part of their practice, because it takes a village, and it's not just one person who can do this. So I feel like those are the directions I would like to take it, and I want to share it. And I thank you for your time, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Naidoo. You really, every time I hear you speak and I follow your work closely, I often think, how do we feed our mental health? How do I feed my mental health? When I'm feeding my children, how do I feed my children mental health? And I think you've really illustrated how powerful it is, and how the long-standing research has been done, and then the emerging research that's just pointing more and more on the power of our food to nourish our bodies and our minds. So thank you so much for that presentation and your leadership. Great.
Thank you.
Now I'm excited to introduce Dr. Robert Lustig. I'm going to read his bio, though I know him quite well, and could definitely go on and on about his leadership in this work. So Dr. Robert H. Lustig is Professor Emeritus of Pediatrics, the Division of Endocrinology at the University of California, San Francisco, UCSF. He specializes in the field of neuroendocrinology with an emphasis on the regulation of energy balance by the central nervous system. His research and clinical practice has focused on childhood obesity and diabetes. Dr. Lustig holds a bachelor's in science from MIT, a doctorate in medicine from Cornell University Medical College, and a master's of studies in law from UC Hastings College of Law. Dr. Lustig has fostered a global discussion of metabolic health and nutrition, exposing some of the leading myths that underlie the current pandemic of diet-related disease. He believes the food business, by pushing processed foods loaded with sugar, has hacked our bodies and our minds to pursue pleasure instead of happiness, fostering today's epidemics of addiction and depression. Yet, by focusing on real food, we can beat the odds against sugar, processed food, obesity, and disease. I'll add that he is a multi-best-selling author, has published numerous leading research studies and papers, and he's also the chief science officer and one of the co-founders of Eat Real, and founded the nonprofit to get to the root cause of disease in America and help prevent disease and stop disease in children before it starts. So thank you, Dr. Lustig, and excited to dive in. I know you have some incredible slides to show us, and excited for this discussion.
Well, thank you, Nora. And I want to just impress upon the audience just the value that Nora brings to the table in terms of this, in terms of leadership in this space. The bottom line is our children are our future, and our children are getting sick with adult diseases. Type 2 diabetes and fatty liver disease were unheard of when I started medical school in 1976. And today it's 25% of children. This is, a debacle. The thing is, what's causing it? And that's what we're going to talk about today. What is causing this? So next slide. So you've heard this term now bandied about for the last 45 minutes. Ultra-processed foods. So what are ultra-processed foods? Well, it's unfortunately 73% of the grocery store is what it is. Pretty much anything with a label means it's been processed. That is actually the definition of processing, is it has a label. Now, not all processed foods are ultra-processed foods. So let me give you a sort of way to think about it. There is a system of classification for food processing now called the NOVA system, developed by my colleague in Sao Paulo, Dr. Carlos Montero. So It's called the Nova system. There are 4 classes. Nova class, the easiest way to explain this would be an example. Let's take an apple. Nova class 1 would be an apple picked off a tree. It's real food. Nova class 2 would be apple slices, destemmed, deseeded, possibly deskinned. So mechanical separation and dispersion. Nova class 3 would be applesauce, macerated, cooked, possibly with a preservative added, maybe with added sugar, maybe not. And then finally, Nova class 4 would be a McDonald's apple pie. And so the question is there any Nova class 1 apple in that class 4 McDonald's apple pie? Only McDonald's knows for sure. But the bottom line is, we have now demonstrated that it is that Nova class 4, the ultra-processed food category, that is the one that is synonymous with both systemic and mental health dysfunction. So I'm going to show you why that is. The first question is, it's called ultra-processed food. Is it food? Next slide. So is ultra-processed food actually food? Well, in order to answer that question, you actually have to know the definition of food. Well, this is right out of the dictionary. So 100% concurrent definition with the way I think anyway, so I'm very happy with it. Substrate that contributes either to the burning or growth of an organism. That's food. So if something that passes your lips contributes to burning or contributes to growth, then it's food. Next slide. Let's look at that. So let's look at burning. All right. Now, ultra-processed food is replete with this chemical, and there's no other way to describe it. It is a chemical called sucrose, or high fructose corn syrup, basically dietary sugar. And that is made up of 2 molecules, glucose here in green and fructose here in red. Okay, those 2 molecules together make up the stuff you put in your coffee. And it turns out glucose actually stimulates burning because it activates this enzyme here called AMP kinase, which is the fuel gauge on the liver cell. So when the cell demonstrates that it's has a reduced energy capacity, then it needs to make more mitochondria, and this is the enzyme that directs that. So AMP kinase is, for lack of a better word, good. It also stimulates this enzyme down here in green, HADH, hydroxyacyl-CoA dehydrogenase, the sum total of which is that glucose actually stimulates mitochondrial beta oxidation, i.e. burning. Now let's look at fructose. Fructose is the sweet molecule in sugar, the molecule we seek, the molecule that's addictive. Turns out fructose inhibits 3, count them, 3 separate enzymes involved in mitochondrial function. It inhibits AMP kinase. It does the opposite of glucose. It inhibits ACAD-L, acyl-CoA dehydrogenase long chain, which is necessary to cleave fatty acids into their 2 carbon fragments so that they can be oxidized. And finally, it inhibits this enzyme here called CPT1A, carnitine palmitoyl transferase 1A, which is the shuttle mechanism to regenerate carnitine, which is the way that fatty acids get into the mitochondria for burning in the first place. The sum total of which means that beta oxidation is reduced. So Ron Kahn, the CEO of Joslin at Harvard, famously said about this study, the most important takeaway of the study is that high fructose in the diet is bad. It's not bad because it's more calories, but because it has effects on liver metabolism to make it worse at burning fat. As a result, adding fructose to the diet makes the liver store more fat, and this is bad for the liver and bad for whole body metabolism. Couldn't agree more. In fact, fructose is a dose-dependent mitochondrial toxin. Next slide. Now let's look at growth. Okay, this is work from my colleague, Dr. Efrat Monsonigo-Ornan, who runs the Department of Nutrition at Hebrew University, Jerusalem. And she asked the question, what about ultra-processed food and growth? And you can see very clearly that in animal studies, okay, and we have human studies that support this, that You see the washout of the bone here with the ultra-processed food and the calorie containing drink. You can see the increase in cortical porosity. You can see the hollowing out of the bone. You can see the change in mechanical tensile strength here, increased fracture rate. And you can see that here. The fracture load that will actually fracture it is 1/4 as much. You want to know why osteoporosis is so common in America today? Here's why. Okay, look at the cortex of the bone. So normal cortex, this red is all that calcium built up. That's what you want. Notice the ultra-processed bone, nothing. And take a look at the cartilage. Look at how ragged that is and how wide it is. That's a disaster. And here's the actual cross-section through the bone. You can see that the normal bone has lots of what we call lacunae, and take a look at how hollowed out that bone is. So in fact, ultra-processed food actually inhibits growth. So if a substrate inhibits burning and inhibits growth, is it a food? Actually, no, it would not be a food, would it? We would actually call that a poison. Next slide. That would be a poison. Well, unfortunately, today, ultra-processed foods are now 1/2 of UK family food purchases, and they are 57% of US consumption and 73% of what's in the US food supply in your American grocery store. So you say, well, people just need to avoid this. Well, in fact, this is the stuff they're buying. And of course, this is what's causing disease, and this is why they are so sick. This is what we are talking about today. It is the transition of our natural ancestral diet to our current ultra-processed food diet that has led to all these deficits in systemic and mental health. Next slide. And we, have the data to show this, and I will show you. These are now a bunch of studies showing the correlation between ultra-processed food consumption and obesity. Next slide. Now you'll see we have hypertension. Next slide. Type 2 diabetes. Next slide. Cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality. Next slide. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Next slide. This is metabolic syndrome. Next slide. And this is Crohn's disease and inflammatory disease. Next slide. And cancer. Next slide. Dementia. Next slide. And this one is depression. Sorry, depression. Next slide. And finally, premature death. The fact is that ultra-processed food is correlated with all these. Now, the question is it causative? We actually have data on causation for type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, fatty liver disease, and tooth decay. We have correlation data for cancer and dementia, but we are working on that, and the data are actually quite robust and strong. Next slide. This is an umbrella analysis that was just published like a month ago. And you can see the identity line is right here, this vertical line. And you can see that in all of these studies, ultra-processed food increases the risk of all of these diseases, including, by the way, mental health disorders, including depression and anxiety, which is now its own pandemic. Next slide. So you've heard this term before, food is medicine. Well, food can be medicine. Unfortunately, food can also be poison. And the big issue, the question is which? How would you know when you walked in the store? Because right now, there's no way of being able to tell unless you know as much as Dr. Mayer, Dr. Naidoo, and me. And that's a big problem. What we need is a method for being able to discern that, because once we have that, then the food industry will actually have to do better. It will actually force them to do better. And so education is where it starts, but ultimately education has to then morph into a societal intervention. Next slide. So we have actually looked at this and how to determine whether or not any given food is healthy or not. And we call this the metabolic matrix. Three things, three precepts, okay? Feed the gut, protect the liver, support the brain. Any food that does all three is healthy by definition. Any food that does none of the three is poison by definition. And any food that does one or two, but not all three, will be somewhere in the middle. In fact, we have now looked at this and demonstrated across the board that foods that adhere to all three are automatically healthy. So we can actually use this as the rubric for determining what is healthy and what's not in order to be able to try to put pressure on the food industry to do better. So feed the gut. You've heard from Dr. Mayer that unprocessed food actually feeds the gut, feeds the microbiome. Ultra-processed food actually causes the stripping of the mucin layer and leads to what we call leaky gut. Short-chain fatty acids are self-healing, but they are the products of fiber. Well, the fiber's been taken out of the food. So fiber is necessary for microbiome health. Well, unfortunately, processed food is fiberless food. On the protect the liver side, fructose reduction, because fructose is a mitochondrial toxin. We have to reduce the glycemic load. We can do that easily by adding fiber. Appropriate hydration, because it turns out dehydration actually makes fructose levels go up higher. And finally, reduce environmental toxins like, for instance, cadmium and other heavy metals, lead, etc. And finally, support the brain. And you heard from Dr. Naidoo about the problem with polyunsaturated fatty acids and omega-6 seed oils. We need more omega-3s, okay, especially during pregnancy, because that is helping contribute to fetal brain structure and brain selective nutrients like zinc and selenium. So these three precepts, feed the gut, protect the liver, support the brain, is how we are looking at how to determine whether or not food is actually good or poison. Next slide, last slide. So the science is now clear. There are four things we have to do in order to make our food supply work for us instead of against us. Less sugar to protect the liver, more soluble and insoluble fiber to feed the gut, more omega-3s and micronutrients to support the brain. And lastly, Dr. Naidoo mentioned emulsifiers. Emulsifiers are detergents. What happens when you swallow a detergent? You get inflammation. Well, all of the emulsifiers in all of the ultra-processed food that holds fat and water together is actually driving inflammation. And we have the data on that as well. What does that mean? It means a real food diet. The problem is that's not what the food industry is selling, because only 10 companies are in control of 90% of the American food supply, and really around the world. And so they can do better, and we know they can do better because we've actually helped a company offshore in the Middle East do better and actually make ultra-processed food healthy by adhering to these four precepts right here. So it can be done. We have to impress upon both the population and also the industry, and finally the politicians, as to the necessity for doing so in order to recoup some of that $12.7 trillion that is being lost because we are cleaning up processed food disease. So with that, I'll stop, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Lustig, for your dedication, your leadership, and your clarity. With that, I'd like to hand it back to our host, Elizabeth Dreiser and Thomas from the Samuel Lawrence Foundation.
Thank you, Nora. We are now clear that our mental and physical health are being compromised. Thanks to our exceptional speakers today, we have learned that processed food is bad for our health and particularly targets the vulnerable communities, the young and low income. And it is bad for our economics. And as a society, it costs us trillions in external costs. So this is a call to action. This year, we start through education, through the Roots Learning Series, hosting exceptional speakers like those who you've heard from today. It is our aim to address this issue at its root cause. Through collective action and funding, we both need to and can create positive impacts. By convening foundations, scientists, experts, policymakers, staffers, and eventually states attorneys general, we can create a broad-reaching educational campaign. We can accelerate basic research on the deleterious effects of ultra-processed foods. And in doing so, we can hold big food accountable for what they've knowingly done. We can also change the way our society structures its food production and distribution so that real whole food is easily available and cost effective. In doing so, the Funders Coalition will act as a bridge. We will coordinate our group effort to make this a reality. If you'd like to learn more about supporting and/or advancing this coalition, please complete the survey that will be circulated to all. Additionally, you can find the Funders Coalition Ending Food-Related Disease LinkedIn page, or you can connect with me or the rest of the team on LinkedIn. As we wrap up our session today, we imagine that there are different sizes and different types of funders that may be interested in taking the next steps. And we look forward to exploring these. Now I'd like to turn the stage over to Elizabeth for some closing remarks.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. Thank you all. As you know, this was developed to start the learning journey. Deep appreciation to all of our panelists, speakers, and to the Samuel Lawrence Foundation, our moderator, Nora, the program manager, Thomas, for all his work, and again, the many hands behind the scenes that made today's event possible. Thank you all, and we will see you next time.